Hello and welcome. So far you've learned about variables and constants and how they're used to keep track of data. You've also learned about functions for organizing and grouping together your code statements. Well, in this lesson, you're going to learn about structures, or structs for short. And these are the basic building blocks to represent your data or to represent something in your app. Structures bring together the functions, the variables, and constants, everything you've learned so far in the last two lessons, all into a neat little package. Now, just before we begin, in case you're new here, my name is Chris and welcome to Code with Chris, the place to be if you want to learn how to make an app. Quick question for you. How are you enjoying Swift coding so far? Are you understanding everything? Let me know by leaving a quick comment below, and on your way down there, please give this video a thumbs up because it helps out more than you know, so thank you. All right, with that said, let's dive in and see what structures are all about. Now let's do a quick recap. First, you had code statements like these. And then I showed you how to use functions to organize and group them together. Now with structures, you can group together your functions. You can also have variables and constants keep track of data inside your structure, but outside of any function. And we're going to talk about these a little later in this lesson. Now let's take a look at our view update lifecycle diagram again. For the view code that represents your UI, you might create a structure to represent your home screen, and all of the view code for your home screen would go into that structure. If you had a second screen in your app, you might create another structure for that second screen, and all of the view code for that second screen would go into that structure. In this case, each structure represents a different screen in your app. Now let's move over to the data retrieval part of this diagram. You might create a structure and call it a data manager, and you're going to put all of the code and functions related to retrieving and processing the data inside of that data manager structure. In this case, the structure doesn't represent a screen in your app, instead it represents a crucial component of your app. So as you can see, structures are very flexible and lightweight, and they're used all over your app. Now let's go into an Xcode playground and take a look at how we can declare our own structure. All right, so here I've got a brand new empty playground. Let's take a look at how we can define our own structures. First, you start with the struct keyword, followed by a space, and then the name of your structure. So I'm going to call this one my struct, and then you put a space and you open up a set of curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, you would put all of the code in your structure, and that's it. We've declared our own structure. Now, before we move on and take a look at what's inside the structure, I want to point out the naming convention of the structure. Notice that I've started it off with a capital letter. This is the standard convention. This is different from the camel casing that we used for the variables and constants and the function names. Those started with a lowercase letter, and it had each subsequent word starting with a capital letter. Whereas for structures, it starts off with a capital letter, and then each subsequent word has a capital letter. All right, now that you know about naming structures, let's go inside and take a look at how we organize the things inside of the structure. So usually at the top of the structure inside the curly brackets, we would declare here all of our variables and constants used to track data that is related to this structure. Now, these have a special name, as I mentioned earlier, and we will get to that later on in this lesson. So up here, after you declare all of the variables and constants tracking data for the structure, the next section you have are all of the functions related to the structure. Now, there are no clearly defined sections in a structure. You know, all of the code really just goes in between the curly brackets, but usually this is how you would organize all of the different pieces of code inside of your structure. So at the top, variables and constants, and then at the bottom, all of the functions. So as you can see, structures are great for grouping together functions, variables, and constants all related for one thing. But structures are usually meant to represent something in your app. In the view update lifecycle diagram that you saw earlier, we saw examples of a structure being used to represent a screen of your app, as well as to represent a crucial component of your app, like that network manager. So why don't we do another example, and I'll show you a structure that is a little bit more concrete. Let's model it after something. So earlier in the view update lifecycle diagram, you saw that we could use structures to represent a view in our app. So let's go with that. Let's have a hypothetical chat app. And let's say that this structure represents my chat view. So I'm going to change the name of my structure to chat view. Now under variables and constants, I might have a variable to keep track of the message, like the chat message that I'm typing into the chat box. So I'm going to call this message, and the type of data this would probably be a string, and I'm going to assign it an empty string, nothing in between, just two quotes. So that's what's known as an empty string. Now under functions, I could have groups of code that would perform different tasks on this screen. For example, maybe when the user taps on the send chat button, it would execute some code to send the chat message to the server. So I would declare a function. So that's func followed by, let's call this send chat, and 2 rounded parentheses. And I'm going to open up a pair of curly brackets. And inside here, I would put the code to send the chat message. And then in between the variables and constants and the functions, I would have the view code for this screen. And that's all of the code for the UI. So now in this chat view structure, we have a neat little package containing all of the code for that one screen. Now earlier I mentioned that the variables and constants that you declare up at the top of the structure, they have a different name. So now I want to tell you what that is. This variable declaration that I have up here, message, this is known as a property of the chat view structure. If I had additional variable or constant declarations, those would be known as properties of the chat view structure as well. And down here, functions actually also have a different name. A function inside of a structure is known as a method of that structure. So this send chat function is actually a method of the chat view. So now let's just update our comments here so that we use the proper terminology. Instead of variables and constants up here, I'm going to rename this, well, not rename, but just retype my comment and call those properties. And instead of functions, these are going to be called methods, just so we're clear. Now inside of a structure, properties and methods can actually work together to fulfill the duties of the chat view. Let's take a look at some of the special ways in which they can work together. Now let's take a look at this send chat method, for instance. If we were to write the code here to send the chat message, it sure would be handy if we could access the actual message in this message property, right? Well, we actually can. So if I wrote something like this, print, and then inside the parentheses I put the name of the property, in fact I can access that data. And the reason for this is because this property is declared in the scope of this structure. So the scope of this structure is anything in between these two curly brackets, essentially the opening and closing curly brackets of the structure. So any of the methods that I declare in here, for instance, if I declare another one, let's call this one delete chat, because these two methods are also in the same scope, you know, it's inside of the scope of the chat view, I am able to access the property. The properties that you declare up here are accessible to everything within the same scope. So that includes all of the methods that are declared down here. Now I have to say that each method has its own local scope. So this send chat method has a scope inside here, and this delete chat method has its own scope in between these curly brackets. So if I declare a variable inside my send chat method, let's say var prefix equals Chris says, and then let's say I use this prefix and I prepend it to my chat message. So the entire chat message would be Chris says and then something. So maybe I'll print prefix plus message to get that sort of effect. And I wanted to do the same thing inside delete chat. If I try to access the prefix variable, and type print prefix plus message down here inside the delete chat method, you'll see that Xcode complains and it says it cannot find prefix in the scope because this variable is not declared in the same scope. It's declared inside the scope of send chat. So how would we fix this? Well, one of the ways we could do that is to turn this prefix variable into a property that we declare at the top of our structure. Move it outside of the scope of send chat and put it up here into the scope of the chat view instead. So now that I'm declaring my prefix as a property of the chat view, you can see that the errors go away and I can access this prefix property inside both send chat and delete chat methods. Now I want to talk about another type of property. First, let's define what these properties up here are. These are called stored properties, and the reason is because when you access these properties and you reference them by their property name, it just returns to you the value it's stored. There's another type of property where when you access it, it needs to compute or calculate the value before it returns it to you. So let's take a look at what this second new type of property looks like. So let me start by erasing this prefix property up here and deleting that. And then I'm going to declare this new type of property. It starts off just like a normal one. You use var space and then the name of the computed property. I'm going to call it message with prefix followed by the name. Instead of assigning it some data, you open up a set of curly brackets, and here you can put the computational code to compute the value that you will return when this property is called. One thing though, because the value is not immediately known, Xcode can't infer what the data type is. So you actually have to specify the data type after the computed property name. So after message with prefix, I'm going to put colon and I'm going to put string because that is the type of value that this property is going to return. This is different from this stored property up here, message, where I can actually use the shorthand and erase the data type. So it's just var message equals string. And I can do this because I am immediately assigning a value to that property. So Xcode can look at that value and it can determine and infer what the data type for that property should be. With a computed property, I have to explicitly specify the data type. All right, so for my computed property, message with prefix, let's take a look at the code inside of the curly brackets. Here, I am going to use the return keyword, just like with functions, right? I'm going to return Chris says, so this is a string, plus message. So now in my send chat method, instead of printing prefix plus message, I can just return message with prefix. Same thing for delete chat. Instead of prefix plus message, I'm going to return message with prefix. So every time this property is accessed, it is going to run the code inside these curly brackets and return that as the value for that property. It needs to compute it. That's why it's called a computed property. Now with computed properties, there's also a shortcut. If there's only one line of code in here, then I don't need the return keyword because Xcode can assume that this single line of code will output the data that I want to return for my computed property. So I can actually just delete the return keyword. However, if I have multiple lines of code, then I would definitely need that return keyword because Xcode doesn't know which line of code is meant to be the value that gets returned. So for example, inside my computed property, if I say let prefix equals Chris says, and then down here I have prefix plus message, it's not going to know which code statement returns the value. So I actually have to use the return keyword like that, and that's going to be fine. Now, as far as computed properties go, there's definitely more we can talk about, but this will suffice for now. In later chapters in this course, we'll definitely go over computed properties again. All right, let's do a quick recap before we wrap up this lesson. You learned how to declare a basic structure. You learned about properties and methods in a structure. You learned about scope, and you learned about computed properties as well. Now, I know that the hard part is wrapping your head around these concepts. As we code further together, you're going to see these concepts put into practice. To help you remember what you learned today, I highly recommend that you take the quiz and the challenge for this lesson. And don't forget you have the Swift cheat sheet as well. To get all of these extra resources, just visit CodeWithChris.com and sign in or create your account and enroll in the 14-day beginner challenge. Finally, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe and turn on bell notifications. I just want to say one thing before we end. You did it. If you're brand new to coding, these 3 lessons were the mind-bending ones. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how these concepts relate to your actual Xcode project. All right, I'll see you there.